Well, good evening and welcome. I think we have got a very, very wonderful attendance this evening to hear Martin, and we're all looking forward to his lecture. I'm Fiona Waldron, and I'm a council member, and I'll be chairing the lecture this evening. The few housekeeping rules that we have, can I just go over them again? Can you please make sure that any mobile phones are switched off or on silent? You've already been told where the fire exits are, but can I repeat it? Through the door to your outside there, the immediate door out there and downstairs, or this way to the front entrance and out the front entrance. The toilets, there's one disabled toilet on this level and the remaining toilets are downstairs. After, as usual, the lecture, refreshments will be served for you in the foyer area. And at the conclusion of the lecture, of course, we will have a question and answer session. Now, most of you will already be familiar with Martin Sixsmith in his role as a TV journalist, but he is a man of many parts. As a broadcast journalist, he occupied what must have been the two prime foreign correspondent roles in the BBC, both in Moscow and then in Washington. He then crossed the political divide, becoming an advisor and spokesperson for politicians as Director of Communications for the Blair government. He's a successful author of many books, both fiction and non-fiction. He has an enduring interest in psychology, which led him much later in life to take a psychology degree, and he presented a 25-part BBC history of psychology and psychiatry. That interest has doubtless informed the many books he has written about the political and political personalities of post-Soviet Russia. But he is, of course, fundamentally a Russian scholar, a scholar of both Russian language and literature. But I've no doubt that his interest in psychology has informed both his talk tonight as well as those books. And he's going to talk to us, going into the eye of the storm, about Putin, Trump, and the new Cold War. Now, Putin and Trump, of course, are regarded by many of us in the West as the ultimate political villains of our time. But are we right? Or is there a more complex historical and political backstory? No doubt Martin is going to tell us.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The world got lucky. The world got lucky. For 20 years in the 1990s and the early 2000s, we enjoyed peace and prosperity and freedom from war. We cut our defense spending. We poured our resources into education, health, and social protection. But our luck ran out.
We've always had a fantastic relationship with President Putin, with Vladimir.
What's your strategy?
Our plan is to bring them back to the Stone Age.
How can his kingdom last?
You probably spotted that Putin wasn't the real Putin. That was a clip from an over-the-top feature film that was released this year. But how and why did that era of peace come to an end? How did we end up with such fickle and dangerous leaders in the Kremlin and now in the White House? Well, the first thing to say is that the 20 years of peace and prosperity was the exception, not the rule. Historically, the world has always been closer to where we are today. Great power rivalry, struggles for territory and resources, threats of aggression, and more often than not, ongoing wars. Our exceptional 20 years of peace began in 1991 with the collapse of Soviet communism.
President Gorbachev has been overthrown by a military-backed coup. Hundreds of tanks are out on the streets of Moscow. Vice President Gennady Yanayev and hardline communists have taken over. They've declared a state of emergency, banned demonstrations, arrested radicals to save the country from extremists. Boris Yeltsin has called for a general strike. He says people must not obey the new rulers. Thousands have demonstrated against the takeover. There have been isolated clashes with troops. Stock markets around the world have fallen sharply. Billions have been wiped off shares. And Gorbachev himself is reported to be under house arrest at his holiday home in the Crimea.
That was the BBC News from the 19th of August, 1991. I was the BBC Moscow correspondent, and I saw what happened. I was there to see what happened. I saw the Russian people fighting back against the hardline communists who wanted to return Russia to the dark days of Stalinism. I saw the tanks defeated and Gorbachev rescued from captivity. And later I saw the coup plotters sent to jail, and I saw Boris Yeltsin come to power on a platform of freedom and democracy and friendship with the West. I was convinced, and many other people were convinced, that the end of Soviet communism meant that autocracy was dead in Russia, that centuries of aggression would be replaced by peaceful cooperation with the international community. And for a while, that seemed to be happening. One of the most memorable press conferences I ever attended was in October 1995 between Boris Yeltsin and Bill Clinton.
If you looked at the press reports, one could see that what you were writing was that today's meeting with President Bill Clinton was going to be a disaster.
Так вот, не первый раз я вам говорю, что вы провалились.
Well, now for the first time I can tell you that you're a disaster.
Be sure you get the right attribution there.
Я надеюсь, что вы правильно все это поняли.
Это доказывает,
This proves
что наше партнерство слишком крепко,
that our partnership
что наше партнерство рассчитано не на один год,
is
не
too
на
strong.
десятилетие, а на столетие,
Our
на
partnership
века.
is not calculated for 1 year or for 5 years, but for years and years to come, tens of years, for a century.
Что мы друзья,
That we're friends.
и мы только совместно будем решать самые сложные, не только двусторонние, но и мировые вопросы.
And that it's only together we're going to be trying to solve not only our joint bilateral issues, but issues affecting the whole world.
Well, that was remarkable, wasn't it? That's 30 years ago this month. And it was massively, massively hopeful. It was a promise of enduring friendship and cooperation between West and East. And even more remarkably, that dream of friendship between Russia and the West stayed alive when Yeltsin's successor, Vladimir Putin, took over. In his first ever national address on New Year's Eve 1999, Putin declared that Russia was committed to peace and democracy, and that he would personally ensure that it continued to guarantee democratic rights and civil liberties.
Свобода слова,
freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of the press, property rights. These fundamental elements of a civilized society will be reliably protected by the state.
As a self-declared Democrat, as we heard it there, and a friend of the West, Putin offered Russia's support to George W. Bush in his campaign against Al-Qaeda. And he set about charming the West, learning to speak English, even to...
You part of me still. For you were my thrill. On Blueberry Hill.
Well, that extraordinary performance was at a charity dinner in 2010, when Putin was still trying to appear human and was still seeking the good opinion of the West. Putin said that he wanted a cooperation agreement between Russia and the European Union. And he told the head of NATO, George Robertson, that Russia could even become a member of the Western military alliance.
First meeting, Vladimir Putin clearly said, I want Russia to be part of Western Europe. I believe that's our destiny. He said, these guys, waving to the guys at the end of the long table, said, he said they don't agree, but I want to do it. So that was the prelude. The second meeting, he said, when are you going to invite Russia to join NATO? No, it wasn't a leg pull. It was a serious question, but he already knew the answer. And they say in politics, you should never ask a question unless you already know the answer.
Well, George Bush said that he'd looked into Putin's soul, and Tony Blair said that Putin was a man the West could trust. But that Putin is now unrecognizable. He's become a dictator dedicated to repression at home and aggression abroad. He's an international pariah, an indicted war criminal. So what happened? Well, it could be that Putin was just lying when he said he supported the West and he supported freedom and democracy and friendship. But it could also be that he was sincere, and therefore he must have changed his views between then and now. And if that is the case, I think it's useful to ask, what happened to change him? Let's try to explain how things might look from Putin's point of view. As we know, Russia has always feared its vulnerability to invasion from the West. You only have to look at Napoleon and Hitler to understand that. The Soviet Union had the security of the Warsaw Pact countries in Eastern Europe that served as a buffer, as a protection from the West. But all that changed when the Berlin Wall came down in 1991, and the US in 1989, sorry, and the USSR collapsed in 1991, 2 years later. So this is the Malta summit in December 1989, and I was there. The wall had just come down, and George Bush wanted Mikhail Gorbachev to promise that Moscow wouldn't try to stand in the way of the peaceful reunification of Germany. And Gorbachev agreed. And in return, Bush promised that NATO would not advance into the former Soviet satellite states in Eastern Europe. And 2 months later, I was in Moscow when the US Secretary of State, James Baker, came to town and said twice, not 1 inch eastwards. Not 1 inch eastwards. But what happened? Well, NATO disregarded all of that and moved its forces and its missiles into Romania, Poland, the Czech Republic, and the Baltic states, right up to Russia's borders.
After 1991, when Russia expected that it would be welcomed into the brotherly family of civilized nations, nothing like this happened. You tricked us. I don't mean you personally when I say you. Of course, I'm talking about the United States. The promise was that NATO would not expand eastward, but it happened 5 times. There were 5 waves of expansion. We tolerated all that. We were trying to persuade them. We were saying, please don't. We are as bourgeois now as you are. We are market economy and there is no communist party power. Let's negotiate.
Well, that clip was from an interview that Putin did with the former Fox News presenter Tucker Carlson last year. Carlson is what Lenin called a useful idiot, swallowing the Kremlin's propaganda without challenging its lies and prevarications. So let us not make that same mistake. Putin says that he fears that the West wants to attack Russia. But you and I know that NATO is not an aggressive alliance. It's an organization of mutual defense. Putin doesn't believe that. He sees Western missiles on his doorstep and he's worried. When NATO started talking about Ukraine becoming a member, he called his generals together in the Kremlin and he warned them that there'd be NATO missiles, enemy missiles, he said, stationed in Ukraine that could reach Moscow in less than 10 minutes. Russia's only chance, Putin said, was to move into Ukraine to stop it happening.
We would have never considered to even lift a finger if it hadn't been for the bloody developments on Maidan. Because we agreed with the fact that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, our borders should be along the borders of former Union's republics. We agreed to that. But we never agreed to NATO's expansion, and moreover, we never agreed that Ukraine would be in NATO. We did not agree to NATO bases there without any discussion with us. For decades, we kept asking, don't do this, don't do that.
Is Putin right? Well, you may remember in 2003, Washington and London used the claim of Saddam Hussein's missiles possibly reaching Cyprus in 45 minutes as a reason to invade Iraq. And now NATO missiles would reach Moscow in 10. Is the parallel valid? Well, possibly. Let's say, for argument's sake, that a communist government had come to power in France in the very early years of the Cold War, something that was by no means impossible. And let's say that government received large amounts of money from the Kremlin and agreed in return that Soviet missiles should be stationed in Calais and Boulogne. Let's say that Moscow insisted that the missiles were purely defensive and not meant to intimidate the UK. I mean, I think you can see where I'm going with this and how the Kremlin might have a similar view of NATO missiles in Ukraine. Could the West have done things differently? Well, again, possibly. When Soviet communism collapsed in 1991, the West declared it had won the Cold War, that Western values had triumphed and Western democracy would now rule the world.
For over 40 years, the United States led the West in the struggle against communism and the threat it posed to our most precious values. This struggle shaped the lives of all Americans. It forced all nations to live under the specter of nuclear destruction. That confrontation is now over. The nuclear threat, while far from gone, is receding. Eastern Europe is free. The Soviet Union itself is no more. This is a victory for democracy and freedom. It's a victory for the moral force of our values. Every American can take pride in this victory.
George Bush Sr.'s address in December 1991 set the tone for a decade of Western triumphalism. The West treated the Russians as a defeated enemy who had to submit to Western tutelage. Because we stood firm, George Bush declared, America now stands alone as the undisputed leader of the world. In 1991, that unipolar world looked entrenched, and Western liberal democracy was proclaimed as the only viable system for the whole planet. The US political scientist Francis Fukuyama very famously called it the end of history.
It used to be that there were many alternative forms of government, monarchies and fascist dictatorships, and for many years we thought communism was our major rival and alternative type of civilization. And one by one in this century, every one of those has collapsed. And not every country is a liberal democracy. There are many dictatorships of the right and the left remaining. But as a systematic idea that has some dynamism and some real vitality, liberal democracy is really all there is now.
For the next decade, Washington and the European Union felt they could impose democracy in the former Eastern Bloc. Bill Clinton called it making the Russians eat their spinach. And even he recognized that it might not be very popular. We keep telling Boris Yeltsin, this is what you've got to do, Clinton said. We keep telling him, here's some more dirt for your face. Well, Western triumphalism was pretty short-sighted. The Yeltsin years of so-called democracy in the 1990s brought Russia to its knees. The economy collapsed, the state failed to pay pensions and wages, and people's savings were wiped out by runaway inflation. It's hardly surprising that the Russians didn't like it. Millions of them, including most crucially Vladimir Putin, developed a deep resentment of the arrogant Westerners who treated them with contempt. It left Putin aching for revenge, and he's a man who really bears a grudge. You can sense his resentment today in the burning anger and the warped logic behind his invasion of Ukraine, which brings us to this man.
If I were president, and I say this, I will end that war in one day. It'll take 24 hours. I know Zelensky well. I know Putin well. I would get that ended in a period of 24.
You can break that deal.
100%. It would be easy. That deal would be easy.
Well, that boastful prediction, of course, came before Donald Trump began his second term as president and before he discovered that things aren't quite as simple as he thought they'd be. Trump was convinced that Putin liked him. And if Putin liked him, he was convinced that Putin would do whatever Donald wanted him to do. So he spent the last 10 years lavishing praise on a man who's invaded 3 different countries, threatened the West, and murdered his political opponents.
Donald Trump is gushing again over Vladimir Putin.
If he says great things about me, I'm going to say great things about him.
Trump believes Putin called him brilliant a few months ago. Putin later said he only called Trump bright. But tonight, it's Trump's comments about the Russian president's leadership made to NBC News, which have brought serious fallout.
I mean, the man has very strong control over a country. Now, it's a very different system, and I don't happen to like the system, but certainly in that system, he's been a leader far more than our president has been a leader.
Putin, the man who invaded Ukraine, annexed Crimea, backs the brutal Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, crushes those who oppose him inside Russia, and may well be responsible for the hack of the Democratic National Committee's computers. That Vladimir Putin, Trump says, outshines President Obama. Fresh meat for Hillary Clinton.
It is scary because it suggests he will let Putin do whatever Putin wants to do and then make excuses for him.
Well, Vladimir Putin is a former KGB man, so he knows how to manipulate people. He recognized straight away that Trump is a man of great vanity and zero self-awareness. So he went all out with the flattery. He sent Trump a present on his birthday, a portrait of Trump that Trump described as beautiful. Here it is.
We're getting our first glimpse this morning of a portrait gifted by Vladimir Putin to Donald Trump. It features a notably slimmer-looking US president with his fist raised, depicting his reaction after the first attempt on his life last year. In the background, Lady Liberty clutching the torch. Trump's envoy has previously described the portrait as beautiful and said the president was clearly touched. And it is notably very different to this portrait of the president that he begged to be removed from Colorado's state capitol building.
The likeness is uncanny.
Well, Trump seems remarkably unaware that Putin is playing him and almost certainly laughing at him. There's been speculation that Putin has some sort of hold over Trump, some sort of compromising material or a dark secret to blackmail him into doing the Kremlin's bidding. But I have to say, I've spoken to multiple intelligence sources and I haven't found any evidence at all of that. I think genuinely, it's just a case of Putin being very cunning and Trump being very naive. But what's really worrying is that Trump is not only praising Putin, he's also striving to emulate him, to get for himself the sort of unchecked power that Putin has been wielding for a decade. As we know, US democracy is meant to be protected by checks and balances and constitutional guardrails to temper the power of the president. But since returning to the White House, Trump has changed all that. He's surrounded himself with yes men and enablers. He's smashed constitutional constraints, and he has literally declared himself king. Just like Putin, he's trampled on free speech, he's suborned the judiciary, he's demonized the media and crushed protests on the streets. He's secured the backing of America's oligarchs by the offer of mutual enrichment, and he's inflated his own personal wealth by flouting ethical standards. US foreign policy is no longer based on values, but on greed. At home, there are lies, coercion, and indoctrination. The Kremlin and the White House both believe they should intervene in the most intimate areas of people's lives, from faith and love to sex and health. Like Putin, Trump tells educators what school children should be taught and threatens universities when they beg to differ. Like Putin, he thinks the Constitution can be fixed to make him ruler for life. The interesting thing for me is that Putin and Trump both came to power in ostensibly electoral democracies. Then both of them began to dismantle the pillars of democracy from within. They both act as autocrats. They take far-reaching policy decisions on the basis of personal emotions, grudges and slights and vendettas. Putin invaded Ukraine because he regards the collapse of the USSR as a personal humiliation, and he's dedicated his life to avenging it. Trump threatens to destroy NATO and terminate America's historical alliances because he feels that he's being shortchanged. And one of the reasons he's threatening Ukraine is because Volodymyr Zelensky wouldn't help him dig the dirt on Joe Biden's son when Trump was campaigning in 2016.
Thank you for coming. I'm here with President Volodymyr Zelensky, President Ukraine, we call him, and I've stopped a lot of wars, the biggest, and I'm gonna stop this.
If I may, Mr. President, this is not war of Russia, United States. This is war of Russia, Ukraine, and we must be at the table. When Putin was...
I'm gonna stop you there. He's a very nasty to Putin, isn't he? And Putin's a great guy, but listen to him. He's very nasty, and you should be thankful. You have to say thank you.
Well, I did say thank you. I thank American people.
But you didn't thank me, and you have to thank me.
I thank American people.
You don't dress nice. You don't have a tie. You dress like it's gym day, quite frankly, and it's rude. You look like a millennial going to Starbucks. You got no buttons. It's a little too comfortable. You have to say thank you. We have a thing in America called manners.
Yes, I said thank you.
Shut up, you're a nasty man. Shut up and use your manners.
I said thank you.
Shut up, you're rude, no manners. You have to say thank you. When I met with Putin, I said thank you. I said it beautifully. I said thank you so much. I said I love you. And I shook his hand, and I bowed, and I licked his boot. And he said, it's not shiny enough. And I said thank you. And I licked it again, and I made it so shiny. I really did.
Yes.
Not the real Trump, not the real Zelensky. I was from an American satire show called Saturday Night Live. For 80 years after the end of the Second World War, Western Europe relied on the protection of the United States. And Washington guaranteed European security. Ever since President Harry Truman pledged to support free democratic nations that were threatened by hostile powers, meaning the Soviet Union.
I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. Should we fail to aid Greece and Turkey in this fateful hour, the effect will be far-reaching to the West as well as to the East. We must take immediate and resolute action.
That speech in 1947 set out the terms of what became known as the Truman Doctrine. But Truman made it clear that America wasn't protecting free Europe for nothing. It was doing so because allowing Russia to damage European interests would also damage American interests.
This is a serious course upon which we embark. I would not recommend it, except that the alternative is much more serious. The free peoples of the world look to us for support in maintaining their freedoms. If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of this nation.
But in 2024, and when Trump was campaigning for his second term as president, he turned the Truman Doctrine on its head.
NATO was busted until I came along. I said, everybody's going to pay. They said, well, if we don't pay, are you still going to protect us? I said, absolutely not. They couldn't believe the answer. They asked me that question. One of the presidents of a big country stood up and said, well, sir, if we don't pay and we're attacked by Russia, will you protect us? I said, you didn't pay? You're delinquent? He said, yes, let's say that happened. No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. You got to pay. You got to pay your bills.
Well, the deterrent power of NATO has always depended on the projection of unity and resolve to resist aggression. So what must Putin have been thinking when he heard Trump urging him to attack NATO countries? He must have been absolutely delighted. Trump's argument was that America was shouldering too much of the burden of NATO spending. And in that sense, it worked, because this year's NATO summit saw pledges of increased spending by the member states and a lot of groveling to Donald Trump. Trump calls that the politics of the deal. Previous US presidents fought the Cold War, and Joe Biden came to the aid of Ukraine because they felt they were defending freedom and democracy. But Trump never talks about values or ideals or morality. He takes decisions on the basis of profit and loss. He forced Ukraine to hand over the bulk of its mineral resources by threatening to cut off US aid. And that may serve the trading interests of the USA, and it undoubtedly gets Trump and his associates rich. But it sends a dangerous signal to the world. It tells Putin that he can buy Donald Trump, that he can weaken American support for the nations he wants to invade by offering Trump a deal. I find that depressing. Mary Trump, the current president's niece, has written a revealing book about his childhood, about his father's bullying and how Donald was made to feel humiliated and how he spent the rest of his life bullying other people to prove that he's better and more successful than they are. I think this photo of Donald and his father Fred says quite a lot. All politicians, of course, bring their feelings and emotions to the job. But it seems to me that Putin and Trump are unduly influenced by them. They've weakened the constraints on their personal authority to the point that they now take irrational decisions and implement them without opposition. It makes the world a dangerous place, more dangerous in many ways than the Cold War itself. In the Cold War, the two sides took decisions based on the interests and values of their competing political systems. But there was a mutual acceptance that both must act within certain limits. Both were convinced that the other was bent on world domination. Both insisted that their own intentions were peaceful, but neither was willing or able to accept that this might also be true of the other side. Things began to change only when Mikhail Gorbachev shook up the old ways of thinking in the Soviet Union, and Ronald Reagan belatedly clocked that many people at the top of the Soviet hierarchy are genuinely afraid of America, as he wrote with a sense of surprise in his diary. I was in Moscow when Reagan came there in May 1988, and I heard the remarkable speech that he made to students at Moscow University, urging the world to make a historic leap of faith to end the hostility.
Sometimes it takes faith. It's like that scene in the cowboy movie, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, which some here in Moscow recently had a chance to see. The posse is closing in on the two outlaws, Butch and Sundance, who find themselves trapped on the edge of a cliff with a sheer drop of hundreds of feet to the raging rapids below. Butch turns to Sundance and says their only hope is to jump into the river below. But Sundance refuses. He says he'd rather fight it out with the posse, even though they're hopelessly outnumbered. Butch says that's suicide and urges him to jump. But Sundance still refuses and finally admits, "I can't swim." Butch breaks up laughing and says, "You crazy fool, the fall will probably kill you." By the way, both Butch and Sundance made it, in case you didn't see the movie.
Well, Ronald Reagan was far from being a great intellectual, but he was a great communicator. And I remember looking around the room and seeing the audience slowly realize that Reagan's parable of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid was actually about the leap into the unknown that he and Gorbachev were about to make. And more than any other politician, I think Reagan relied on personal interaction. He formed an emotional bond, first with Margaret Thatcher, that was then extended to include Mikhail Gorbachev. But it was a relationship of equals with trust on all sides, quite different from the poisonous, duplicitous relationship between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. And it did more than anything to bring the Cold War to a peaceful resolution. This is me at the Berlin Wall on a school trip across Europe to the Soviet Union. Back then, we were Bolshevik grammar school boys going to the mysterious land whose language we'd been learning and discovering a fascinating universe full of threats and danger, but inhabited by warm, hospitable people who were disconcertingly friendly. Then, as a graduate student at Harvard in the late 1970s, I saw the superpower standoff from the other side. And the Americans in my class had grown up in the era of duck and cover drills anticipating nuclear war. Memories of paranoia-inducing McCarthyism remained fresh. And thanks to Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, they all knew exactly how the apocalypse would be played out.
Duck and cover. Be sure and remember what Bert the Turtle just did, friends, because every one of us must remember to do the same thing. That's what this film is all about. Duck and cover. Paul and Patty know this. No matter where they go or what they do, they always try to remember what to do if the atom bomb explodes right then. It's a bomb. Duck and cover. Sundays, holidays, vacation time, we must be ready every day, all the time, to do the right thing if the atomic bomb explodes. Duck and cover. That's the first thing to do. Duck and cover. First, you duck. Then, you cover. You duck and cover tight. Duck and cover under the table. It's a bomb. Duck and cover.
He did what we all must learn to do. You and you and you and you. Duck and cover.
Well, it sounds laughable now, but many young Americans were scarred for life by memories of duck and cover and Bert the Turtle's jaunty song explaining what to do as the world comes to an end. And that's all becoming relevant again now as international tensions rise and nightly news bulletins carry horrific tales from Ukraine and Gaza and Iran, and looming military threats revive the emotional trauma. Nuclear-armed missiles are still pointed at our cities. Vladimir Putin has talked about using them. Today's governments seem no better at examining their psychological assumptions than their predecessors did. And disturbingly, our lives still depend on the quirks, the paranoias, and the anxieties of the men and women who lead us. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'll leave it there, but do try not to worry.
And Martin's going to answer questions from the floor.
Is it possible to say what sort of support Putin has in Russia?
Yes. Is it possible to say what support Putin has in Russia? Yes and no. If you believe the official statistics, 99% of Russians support his war in Ukraine. But that's kind of explicable by looking at the way those statistics are collected. Because if you're walking down Gorky Street in Moscow and an official-looking man with a clipboard comes up and says to you, "Do you support President Putin?" you're very likely to say yes. There is undoubtedly a lot of discontent with Putin. And we saw in the early days of the special military operation in February 2022 that there were demonstrations. People went out on the streets. But the repression was so fierce, so draconian, that people have fear now for their lives. You can get sent to prison for 15 years by carrying a placard that says "No war," or even by carrying a placard with no words on it. It's quite a scary situation. But the Russians have always thought for themselves, and this is something I've learned over my years being there, first as a student and then as the BBC correspondent. And one way they have of maintaining their sort of sense of dignity and their sense of independence is through humor. And the Russians have this very sort of wry, sort of biting series of political jokes. And the one I'll just tell you now, which is kind of an answer to your question, is about the two Secret Service men, the two FSB men, who are having a drink in the canteen in the Lubyanka after work. And Dmitry leans over to his friend Ivan and he says, "Tell me, Ivan, what do you think of this Putin guy?" And Ivan says, "The same as you do." And Dmitry thinks for a minute and says, "In that case, it's my duty to arrest you."
Yes, this is a lady.
Hi, thank you, Martin. That was fascinating. You've had a seat at the most interesting tables. Okay, hi, thank you. That was fascinating. So my greatest hope is that the picture you just put up of those two old men is that they're not going to live forever. And also, I probably have more hope that Trump won't be president for a third term, you know, so he will be replaced. But what comes next in Russia? I mean, who's behind Putin? What is there hope that there will be change?
So let's deal with Trump first of all. I mean, the White House is now producing hats with Trump 2028 on them and T-shirts that say Trump 2028 changed the Constitution. And that, yes. So that's the hope, isn't it? That the balance of power in Congress will change in November next year and Trump won't be able to change the Constitution. I mean, he keeps saying it in a jokey way, but I feel there's sort of something serious behind it. And the parallel is that Putin did exactly the same. Because the Russian constitution, when he came to power, said you can only serve 2 4-year terms. And he got to 2008 and thought, oh, I'm not ready to. He elected in 2000, re-elected 2004, 2008, he should step down. So he did a sort of soft shoe shuffle and he changed places with Dmitry Medvedev. Putin became prime minister for 4 years. And at the end of those 4 years, they swapped back again. And the term of the presidency was extended to 6 years. So he then had 12 years worth. But he got to the end of the 12 years and thought, well, I just want to carry on. So he's now reset the time limits. He's just been re-elected. He could be re-elected for a further term. So he could be president till well into his 80s. Trump is talking about doing the same thing. And as you say, you know, the hope is that the Congress will change. If Trump goes, the danger is that the damage he's done to democracy, mainly in his second term, his first term was kind of, you know, restrained compared to what he's doing now. The damage he's done to democracy by undoing all the checks and balances that keep the president, limit presidential power, that they will have gone. And that the next person, however well-intentioned, might take advantage. It's very unlikely to put the genie back in its bottle. And it could also, of course, be J.D. Vance, which would be even worse than Donald Trump in many ways. Putin, yeah, okay. I mean, you know, it's sort of, everybody keeps saying he's looking very ill. And I keep reading on the Russian blogosphere that, you know, he keeps going in for blood transfusions and he's got leukemia and he's got Parkinson's, he's on steroids. He looks pretty healthy to me. And the sad thing is that opposition in Russia is now not coming from the liberal left anymore. It's coming from the right. So it's people who are saying that he's not being tough enough, that he should, you know, do more in Ukraine, that he should actually use nuclear weapons. Dmitry Medvedev, the guy we thought was a sort of reasonable liberal politician, is now the attack dog. And he keeps saying we could sort out the whole problem of Ukraine just with one atomic bomb. And worryingly, the target he keeps mentioning is London. So I don't want to be a merchant of gloom and doom, but I can't see any immediate improvement. America, of course, democracy may well kick back in. I can't see any immediate prospects in Russia of things changing for the better.
That's just yep.
Oh, sorry, Micah. Do you think there's any scope that the members of NATO, apart from the United States, might get more closely together and more determinedly together without falling out totally with the United States and Trump's administration, but just showing a great deal more determination to keep NATO growing with or without enough US backing?
Yes, I mean, I think that's what we must hope is going to happen. And to be fair to the other members of NATO, they've been pretty resolute in their declarations of support for Ukraine. But I think they're aware that, you know, these 20 years of the peace dividend that we spoke about has depleted the military in many European countries. They are starting to rearm. You know, in this country, we are spending more, other countries are spending more. But at the moment, I couldn't see the non-American members of NATO providing a credible military guarantee to Ukraine if Putin decided he was going to go back in again. So the talks that are going on at the moment are absolutely vital. And, you know, we had this sort of first iteration where Steve Witkoff, half Witkoff as we call him, essentially reiterated all the talking points that Putin wanted. And then we had talks in Geneva over the weekend when Starmer and the other members of the coalition of the willing redrafted that. And the plan that they came up with, it seems, is acceptable to Zelensky in Ukraine. So the big test is now, if Trump takes that on board and goes back to Putin, what's Putin going to say? But the key point in all of that, I think, to answer your question, is the issue of security guarantees for Ukraine after the war has ended.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a question about recent speech of Sergei Karaganov, who is the strategist on the Kremlin. And he said something very important about all nuclear weapons from Medvedev and stuff. He said that Russia needs to infuse animal-like fear in the West, that they like to distort our will to even defend ourselves. Just run away from Central Eastern Europe, just don't put enough emphasis on our defense. Do you have any reflections from all of your experience in media, how media would be more resilient for Russian disinformation and Russian information campaigns? Thank you.
How we deal with Russian disinformation and
Yes, and how would the future generation improve media culture and?
Yes. Well, Sergei Karaganov is a man I know, and he is indeed a mouthpiece of the Kremlin. I think we've been very slow in understanding the nature of the challenges from Russia. The sort of popular term is a hybrid war, that all methods of disruption are valid. For instance, we've seen Russian trawlers lurking around our coastlines, mapping the undersea power lines and cables, which we depend on. And, you know, it's very likely that if push came to shove, Russia could shut down a lot of our infrastructure by, you know, taking out these cables. We've seen the troll factories in St. Petersburg, which churn out misinformation, false information, and which troll opponents of the regime. I've been on the receiving end of it myself, and I don't count myself as a sort of, you know, out-and-out opponent of the Putin regime, but I try to sort of speak the truth when the truth is there, and I've been trolled by it. So how we deal with that is very difficult. I'm not naive. I'm not sort of an idealist. I know we're doing similar things to them. It's a two-way street. You know, it's not black and white. But I think they're kind of better at it than we are. And I think we have to really run to catch up.
Is there really a chance of peace in Ukraine whilst there's a Western orientated government in charge? Will it be that Putin will never rest until he's got one of his own puppets in charge?
Yes, well, can peace happen until Zelensky and the sort of pro-Western government has gone? That's where it all started back in 2014 when Putin's placeman, Yanukovych, was in charge in Ukraine. And Ukraine started moving towards a partnership agreement with the European Union. Yanukovych, despite being Moscow's man, was prepared to go along the European path. But then he got a phone call from the Kremlin. At the last minute, he said, no way, stop dreaming about being part of Europe in the Russian sphere. And that developed into the violence on the Maidan, the revolution, and the terrible suffering and deaths that happened. So that's at the heart of it. Yeah, I mean, you've hit the nail on the head. At the heart of what Putin wants is a Ukraine firmly in Russia's sphere of influence and no longer associated and leaning towards the West. So on a sort of diplomatic level, the measures that are being negotiated at the moment are crucial. Should there be a ban on Ukraine ever joining NATO? Should Ukraine continue with its negotiations to join the European Union? But Putin has kind of dug a hole for himself, because his rationale for the war was that Ukraine was run by Nazis and fascists, and these fascists were brutalizing the pro-Russian population in Ukraine. Not true. They're not fascists. They're not angels. There's a lot of corruption in Ukraine. So to answer your question, I think the key thing is what Putin can now present as a victory. And judging by the points in the initial peace plan that Witkoff drew up, he kind of could, for the moment, could sell as a victory the whole of the Donbass, limits on Ukraine's armed forces, and an undertaking for Ukraine not to join NATO. That might keep him happy for a while. The problem with Putin is you can't trust him as far as you can throw him. And he's signed agreements in the past and reneged on them. So the worry would be that, okay, we reach a peace accord now, but he uses the next 3 or 4 years to rearm and rebuild his military, and then it all starts all over again.
Can I just ask you, Martin? What do you think of the Putin administration? Because it seems to be that they're trying to get rid of Putin. And I think that the Putin administration is trying to get rid of Putin. I think it was somehow referred to at the beginning that Putin started out differently, on a different trajectory, saying that he wanted to join NATO, trying to woo the West, and indicating that he might even join the European Union. And we saw the film of that kind of performance earlier on. Was he ever sincere? Was there ever any different possibility?
Well, that's the crucial question. He had been Boris Yeltsin's prime minister, and he'd been an official in the Kremlin under Yeltsin. And in those Yeltsin years, the Russian government position was that we are in favor of Western-style liberal market democracy. We want to be friends with the West. We want to get rid of our authoritarian, militaristic past. So for the first few years, he did carry on saying all these things. I think the key turning point was in 2007 when he went to Munich and made a speech at the Munich Security Conference, in which he started to express his impatience with the West. He said, you know, we're trying to be open to the West. The West is not having any of it. And actually, you know, we can't be kept in the waiting room forever. Did he plan that in advance? I don't know, but I think that's the trajectory he's gone through.
I'm interested in your view on the next big player in the game, which is China. Where do you see China's link, involvement, expectations, long game? What's your view on China in all of this?
On China, they've been incredibly adept at playing the international situation. World politics kind of always been a triangular thing, hasn't it? It's been Russia, the West, and China. And Richard Nixon tried to reset that by, you know, very famously going to China to sort of tilt the balance against Russia. What Putin has done is he's courted China and kind of tipped the balance in the other direction. But it's not the way it has always been. The relationship between Moscow and Beijing, the two great communist powers in the world, was always that Moscow was number one and Beijing was the supplicant. It's not like that anymore. Putin is in a very difficult economic situation, and you know, Western sanctions haven't brought him down, but they have sort of made things very difficult for him. So he's now the supplicant to China. He's selling energy to China at cut prices, and China, it's, you know, Xi Jinping is kind of sort of sitting there and thinking, well, okay, this is, you know, not bad the way things are going. And I think Trump, to his credit, has kind of worked out that the long game is between the US and China. And, you know, if we could want to give him the benefit of the doubt, maybe everything he's doing with Russia at the moment and trying to bring Russia back into the American sphere of economic influence, at least, is with the long view towards what's going to happen with Beijing. But I think if anyone's come out of this really well, it's China.
When Gorbachev was under house arrest in the Crimea, he famously relied on the World Service of the BBC to know what was going on. And I wonder whether that is still the BBC's reputation. It seems that Trump has got the BBC on the run. 100 BBC journalists have complained about its coverage of Gaza. I'm wondering, as a former BBC man, how you view the sure-footedness of the BBC now at home and abroad?
Well, first of all, the BBC remains the world's most trusted broadcaster. That's absolute. There's no sort of debate about that. In my own career, I was in Moscow when Gorbachev was under house arrest. So, you know, I was doing a lot of the broadcast. I was the television correspondent. But a lot of that material was going out on the BBC World Service. And as you say, when he came back from house arrest, he thanked the BBC for, he had a radio. He was down in his holiday home on the Black Sea when the hardline communists staged their putsch in August 1991. And Gorbachev was under house arrest, but he secreted a radio on which he was able to listen to the BBC World Service. So that's only one example. I mean, going around, I had 20 years as a foreign correspondent, and everywhere I went, people recognized that the BBC was the BBC. And it got me, you know, sort of nice treatment because people wanted to talk to the BBC. BBC is in a tough moment right now, partly due to its own ineptitude, partly due to a campaign against the BBC, led by, you have to say, the Murdoch press, plus the Telegraph, the Mail, and people who don't have the BBC's best interests at heart. Part of it is the people who would like to see a media scene in Britain similar to that in the United States, where there's no real public service broadcasting. NPR has been completely weakened, and the television news networks now are openly political. You've got, if you're a MAGA supporter, you listen to Fox News. If you're a Democrat, you listen to CNN. And there are people, including Rupert Murdoch, who would like to see that happen in this country. I think that would be a shame, because the BBC, you can at least, for all its mistakes, you can be reassured that the BBC is not institutionally biased. It makes mistakes, but I've seen governments of the right saying it's institutionally biased to the left, and I've worked with governments of the left, a Labour government, saying it's clearly institutionally biased towards the Tories. So, the answer is, having worked in it, it's not biased. It might make mistakes, but its impartiality is at the heart of what the BBC tries to do.
He talked about the new Cold War, but what we have at the moment in Europe, particularly obviously in the east of Europe, is hot war in the Ukraine. And you said correctly that European leaders are responding, rearming and so on. But my feeling is that they really are not still acting rapidly enough. We have a hot war, and there's a need to make it hotter, for European countries to buy 100 out of the 1,000 F-16s that are distributed around the world and could be bought at quite low price, and so on. There's just still very slow action. The Swedish government could supply 50 Gripen. Okay, and so there's still surely a need for more drive, more initiative.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. We're behind the curve, but we're running to catch up. I think we've kind of been knocked off balance a little bit by the Biden years, when America was willing to supply armaments to Ukraine, but at a very sort of limited pace. Counterfactual history is a great thing, hindsight is a great thing, but you just think in February 2022, if the US had put all the armaments at the disposal of Zelensky that it provided over the next 4 years, if they'd all been there in spring of 2022, when Ukraine was driving the Russian forces back, things might have been very different. And Trump has been no better, because he's been so inscrutable. It's very hard to figure out, he says one thing one day and changes his mind the next day. It was only 3 weeks ago that he was saying, I'm going to send Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. And that would put Moscow within striking distance of Ukrainian territory. And then, of course, he changed his mind, because he kind of listens to one person and then listens to another person. And he got nobbled by Putin, who dissuaded him from doing that. But none of that excuses the sort of eye off the ball that European countries have had over the last few years. And, we do need to run faster to catch up.
Presentation. You made some very helpful comparisons thinking about where missiles might be situated to help us understand feelings after, in 1991, an absolute undertaking had been given that NATO wouldn't expand 1 inch eastward. And of course, there were many tranches of expansion after that. In the view of what happened, and just following from what you said about Putin's change of attitude in 2007, I was rather surprised to hear you say that NATO is not dangerous. Now, if we're talking about the past tense and the way NATO was behaving, and we understand NATO essentially, maybe being an instrument of America, or America's foreign policy attitudes being primary in terms of thinking how NATO has behaved and understanding how incredibly aggressive America has been worldwide since the Second World War, maybe 76 direct involvements in regime change, et cetera, I was a little surprised to hear you say that NATO was not aggressive.
I think I said NATO is not an offensive alliance, it's a defensive alliance, and that is enshrined in NATO articles. Of course, the United States, and all those instances of regime change have been US governments doing that. It's not been NATO forces. Yes, of course. And NATO, I think this sort of goes to the heart of what changed Putin's attitude, if he did change, was that he felt that he'd been cheated by the West, that he had an undertaking that the buffer states that the Soviet Union had would remain neutral. And that didn't happen. And NATO's explanation for that is that, well, these states wanted to join NATO. So what are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to say to Poland, no, you can't join? And the key figure was Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State, who was herself of East European heritage, and she really pushed these waves of expansion that you referred to. But yes, so I mean, you know, that the problem is that that has happened now, and if we're looking forward, we have to kind of reach some understanding with Russia. And I think Russia has made it harder for us to reach that understanding by what it's done in Ukraine. And, you know, the feeling is, you know, maybe we could have reached an agreement with Russia. You may remember in February 2022, when Putin's troops were massed on the border, there was a flurry of diplomatic activity. And NATO started saying, the West started saying, well, maybe we'll look at some of the grievances we've got. You know, maybe we'll reduce the forces we've got in Eastern Europe. But it was too little too late. So I think it's going to be harder now, after all the bad blood that's happened in the last 4 years, for us to go back to that.
If America is a problem, do you see Trump as the cause of it or a symptom of it?
Thank you very much. Yes, America's problem is Trump a symptom of it or a cause of it? I think there's been this sort of Trump's view of America is not new. Trump's view of America first, you know, fortress America. The world is not our concern. Why should we be paying for NATO, for European countries, the defense of European countries? Goes back a long way. And I think it's just a sort of very exaggerated version of that which Trump has espoused. He's a very transactional president as well. That's the other thing that sort of differentiates himself from previous presidents. That, you know, as I said, Joe Biden and others still had this sort of idea that we could run world politics and diplomacy on a value-based, on a system-based basis, that, you know, we're defending freedom, we're defending democracy. But Trump doesn't want anything to do with that now. He's, you know, he kind of would sell his auntie down the river if it brought him some, you know, advantage. There've been some terrible things. You know, the ambush of Zelensky in the White House. I think that was absolutely shameful. His justification of the murder of Khashoggi, by saying a lot of people didn't like that guy, you know, is that a reason for, you know, for him to be cut up with a bone saw? It's not. And you know, just last week he said, well, of course, if Zelensky wants to, he can carry on fighting his little heart out. I mean, that's so disrespectful of, you know, the tens of thousands of people who've died in Ukraine. Yeah. As you can see, I have quite a hard time with him.
I think we have to face the fact that Trumpism and Putinism can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can't hear you.
Are not confined to Russia and America, but are quite widespread in many European countries. And in my opinion, we've got a version here at home in Britain in the form of Mr. Farage, who is now leading the polls. I wonder what
in the form of Mr. Who, sorry?
Mr. Farage, Nigel Farage.
Yes.
Our homegrown version of Putin, or from the same stable, let's put it that way. and now leading the polls.
Yeah.
And having not only his own party, but having a great deal of influence over the Conservative Party as well.
Yes.
So the question is simple. Even if there's not much we can do about what's happening in Ukraine or Russia or America, what do we need to do here in Britain in particular, and also in Europe, to try to prevent what has happened in these other countries from happening to us?
We have a great advantage in this country that democracy still broadly functions, and we can choose who we want to lead us. So the key thing is, the simple thing is, don't vote for reform. For God's sake, don't vote for reform. And I think we're at a sort of crucial turning point, because in the past, you could choose between Labour, the Tories, the SNP, and it was kind of within the rules of a game, but this is a game changer. This is somebody from outside the system who doesn't respect the system and who wants, in many ways, to destroy the system. And it's not just here. It's, the sort of rise of populist despots across the world has been a phenomenon of recent years. Viktor Orban in Hungary, Fico in Slovakia, Putin, of course, in Russia, the far right Le Pen in France. But, for goodness sake, let's make sure it doesn't happen here. We're probably coming to an end, aren't we? But I should just say that the book I'm writing at the moment is, it's called Despots: How Donald Trump is Turning America into Putin's Russia. And the book kind of does what it says on the tin, because it traces the remarkable parallels between what Putin did at the beginning of his reign in 2000 and what Trump is now doing at the beginning of his second term in office. Putin is 25 years down the track. Trump's just beginning. But I think the warning, as with Mr. Farage, as you say, is heed the warning signs early and don't let things get out of hand.
Do you think in the early years, rather than a change with Putin, Putin used Maskarova to persuade the West to remove the nuclear arsenal that was sitting in Ukraine, which was bigger than the one in Russia, at their expense, therefore leaving the Ukraine wide open to what he's just done?
Yes. So the Budapest Accords, which happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, were a cast iron treaty with guarantees from everybody who signed it, including Ukraine, the West, and Russia. And the guarantees were that if Ukraine agreed voluntarily to give up its nuclear arsenal, its territory, its sovereign independence and its territory would be respected by all parties. And look where that got us.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Do you think back to 2014 when it first started, if Obama had been more fearless and stood up to him, would we be here today talking about what's actually happened, do you think?
Yes, very good question.
Stand up to the bully.
Yeah. So yes, have we given him sort of permission to do what he did in 2022? Yeah, I mean, it's not the first instance of aggression from Russia. 2008, they invaded Georgia. 2014, they annexed Crimea. On both those occasions, we said, you're very naughty, don't do it again. And what's Putin going to think? There were some sort of mild sanctions after Crimea. So what's Putin going to think? I've done it twice. They've, wrapped me over the knuckles, but nothing ever happened. So when we come to February 2022, he's going to think, of course, they're going to do the same thing again. Thank goodness we haven't. We've been much, much stricter with the sanctions, and we've supported Ukraine. But even now, we're wavering about it. Yeah, yeah. So the gentleman says, Putin warned Obama, don't you dare interfere. Yeah, so, things might well have been different.
Yeah.
How do you think America and NATO countries would react if Russia used nuclear warfare on Ukraine?
Yeah, how would NATO and America react if, do you mean battlefield nuclear weapons in Ukraine? Yeah, the crucial thing here is called nuclear signaling. So nuclear signaling means letting your opponent know what you would do if your opponent did something. And there are very many people in the Ministry of Defense here working on that. And I know one of them who's worked on it. So the crucial thing is to send the right signal to Russia that if it goes beyond a certain level of military action, including obviously nuclear weapons, then we will respond in kind. So what we've seen from Putin is a sort of little incremental testing of the West. You know, we've seen drones flying over our airports, closing down the airports. We've seen missiles go mysteriously off course and land in Poland. And he's trying to figure out what the West will do in all of these things. You know, we've seen ships recently in British territorial waters. So he's probing away. And, you know, the idea of battlefield nuclear weapons in Ukraine clearly would take it to a much higher level. So let's hope that these peace talks, you know, do actually get somewhere and we don't get to that stage.
Can you hear me okay? I'm not quite speechless, but I do feel afraid having heard that talk. But even though Martin said it wouldn't be so scary, it is quite scary times that we live in. He told us how Putin had changed to become repressive and aggressive, how Trump had moved from triumphalism, how the US moved from triumphalism to Trumpism. And all of that is a bit scary. It's scary when we're ruled by, for the most part, men who don't know the difference between values and valuables. And it's the latter that they're interested in. We heard about personal relationships. We heard about the danger of humiliating your opponent. I hope that lessons are being learned, and I'm sure you hope so too. It's been a great pleasure to hear this from somebody who was able to say to us, I was there. And that's so impressive. And I can't help wonder, Martin, if you're able to sleep at night or not. Anyway, it's my pleasure to thank Martin for a wonderful talk, to thank him on behalf of the Society. I'm going to present him with our Minerva Medal. I should have said my name's Pat Monaghan. I'm the president of the Society, so I always get to present the medals. This is our Minerva Medal. It's part of the Society's emblem, and Minerva was the goddess of knowledge. And I think we've gained a lot of knowledge this evening. We always give our speaker a Royal Philosophical Society paperweight. Not that they have much paper these days, but please, there'll be refreshments. The next talk is in 2 weeks' time. I wish I could say it was a really cheerful topic. If you look at your program, it's not quite that cheerful. But please join me in thanking Martin for a wonderful talk.